Welcome, welcome. I'm Patrick McMurray, restaurateur from Toronto. I've been in the restaurant trade since I was 16, about 362 years. Owned a couple of restaurants, built them from scratch, and now I teach culinary and hospitality at Centennial College here in Toronto. I'm also most known for my Oyster World extravaganza stuff. So traveling the world, shucking oysters in competition, but also hosting. And now I do a lot of teaching with the Oyster Master Guild. We teach about the world of oyster and what an oyster shucker is, what they should be, how they should present oysters. But with the oyster, it doesn't just stop with the oyster. In my restaurants, it went to like 20, 30 different ingredients that we could put on the actual oyster bed. So there was lobster and crab and scallops and clams and razor clams, and a lot of it was raw mash, but also cooked. And one day I got a call from one of my growers in Prince Edward Island saying, "Hey, we got this thing called green crab. It's like an invasive species. If I ship you a box, can you see what you can do with it?" And this is going on about 15 plus years ago, and it's something new that I'd heard about. So he shipped it to me, and there's this box of lovely little greenies. And I didn't know anything else at the moment. So I was going out to a catering gig, and they just dropped them all into a pot, cooked them up nice and slow, chilled them down. I was like, I'm just gonna pop the carapace and just do it like a little crab butter taste. And I handed it to all the different chefs, and they're like, fantastic, but it looked great on the plate of oysters and fireworks as well. So I was thinking of it more of a garnish type of thing. And then what else could you do with it? So I only got like one or two boxes before, they didn't have enough of them, and then they moved on, and then they didn't really play into it. But it's always been stuck in the back of my head. So when the opportunity came up to join in with greencrab.org, I understand the sustainability and the impact that the crab has on the oyster, and I'm potentially as a shucker have concern about that. If they're going to be eating the little things and it's going to be detrimental to the business of the growers, then that's detrimental to the business of moi and all the other oyster shuckers as well. So that's why I got into this, and I would like to see how we can help out as much as possible.
Awesome. So before we get into some questions, I'm just going to have each panelist give a little introduction on themselves. Kelsey, do you mind starting off and introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. I am Kelsey Meyer-Rust. I am currently a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire, getting my PhD in marine biology. My degree focuses a lot on green crab and oyster interactions in Great Bay Estuary, New Hampshire. Great Bay Estuary, New Hampshire not only is home to natural oyster reefs and a lot of oyster restoration projects, but it's also where most of our oyster farms are located. So I definitely wanted to conduct research in that habitat to get a better understanding of how green crabs are affecting not only the natural wild populations, but also how are they affecting our New Hampshire oyster industry. While being in school, I was also the coordinator for the New Hampshire Shellfish Farmers Initiative for about 4 years. So I've always wanted to, do work to help our industry, help it keep it sustainable and vital, and do research to help improve the industry as much as I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Jason, do you want to give a little background and introduction?
Absolutely. My friends always say, don't forget to put Captain in front of it. So Captain Jason Jarvis, been in the fishing industry just under 30 years, commercial fishing for hire sector, worked on a couple of oyster farms. Matter of fact, Jeff Gardner wanted me to say hi to Pat. So I've been at this a long time. I've been harvesting green crabs for bait for a long time, and then started realizing after Mary got a hold of me that people were eating them. So I think it's been about 7 years that I've been selling them and experimenting with them for food. I'm also one of the founders of Quonochontaug Fish Company, soon to be doing business as Quonochontaug Food Co-op. And I'm also South County fishmonger, so I'm a fishmonger selling my own fish to restaurants. And I'm the board president of the North American Marine Alliance. And I wear about 7 other hats, but we'll leave it right there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Alicia, do you want to give a little background introduction?
I'm Alicia Gaiero. I'm the owner and founder of Nauti Sister Sea Farm located in Yarmouth, Maine. I don't have like a deep relationship with green crabs beyond them being a pretty extreme nuisance on our farm, primarily in the springtime. But yeah.
Cool, cool. All right, and Mike, do you want to close out our introductions?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name's Mike Masi. I'm co-owner of Shell and Claw. We're a small startup company that's been experimenting with soft-shell green crab for the past 3 to 4 years. We were just recently approved for an aquaculture lease in the York River, on which we're going to cultivate American oysters and use it as our molting facility for green crab.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for those introductions. And Patrick, if you want to start us off with the first question, I will let you take the lead.
Sure, thanks very much. Kelsey, we were going to ask you right off the bat, could you share a little bit about your work and take some takeaways from your research with green crab and oysters, and how do they, how does it work? Like, why are the green crabs like attracted to the oyster so much?
Hi, yeah. So I guess my research has a couple different like components to it. So the how I first got started actually. So before I even really started my degree in the fall of 2020, I was working for my current advisor that previous summer, and we were doing a lot of work with like oyster spat on tiles to kind of see where oyster spat were collecting throughout the bay. And when we pulled up our cages, I noticed there wasn't a whole lot of spat on the tiles, but I always noticed green crabs actually in the cages with them. So that kind of is where my curiosity started with how green crabs may be affecting oysters, because the oyster populations have definitely been declining a lot over the past few decades. So and I kind of got familiar with the industry when I started at UNH. So I sent out this IRB approved survey to all the New Hampshire oyster growers, just to kind of gain perspectives from them with how they may feel about green crabs or maybe other pressing concerns that may be affecting their farms. And I asked them a few different questions that I can get into if folks are interested throughout this talk. But it definitely became clear that it is a nuisance, on their farms. And that's kind of, I asked them, a few different questions too about like, would trapping near farms be beneficial? Do you want to know like what they're eating? Things like that. So that's kind of like the first component. And then I did a lot of green crab trapping at both kind of wild / restoration areas in the bay and also near oyster farms, just to kind of see, where are green crabs congregating throughout the bay? Do they congregate more towards these wild restoration oyster areas, or are they congregating more towards oyster farms, or is there really, no difference? So I did that for 2 years, 2021, 2022, for 8 months out of the year, both years. So I was out there a lot, collecting a lot of green crabs. And then kind of that third component was actually trying to understand what green crabs are eating. So I would take their guts out actually out of the green crab stomachs, and we would send them off to like a genome center that we have on campus to kind of get an understanding what are found in their guts. Are they eating oysters? If so, how much of that makes up their entire diet? Is it a huge part? Is it like a little part? And then kind of the last component was actually I mimicked oyster farms myself, and I would stick different size oysters with different size green crabs just to kind of get a better understanding what size green crab can get into what size oyster. And I like stuck GoPros in those cultivation bags just to kind of see like what are they doing when they're in there in that gear, because I feel like sometimes that can be a little bit of a knowledge gap, understanding what do they actually do when they're in there. Are they eating oysters? Are they eating biofouling off the cages? Are they just sitting in there trying to get protection from maybe predators? So that's kind of like the different components to like my research.
That's fantastic stuff. And like what I do is I tell customers what goes on in the oyster farm and they want to know this concept of wild versus farm. Is there a choice? Where do you find the crabs are leaning towards?
Yeah, so through my like my trapping, my monitoring stuff through traps, there the green crabs throughout the bay definitely was not uniform because there was actually one site where I didn't catch many green crabs. Um, but in terms of like the different farm sites and one other wild site, there wasn't a major difference between them. I actually think it had to do more with environmental parameters at these different sites rather than the actual oysters themselves, because throughout the bay, one site might be more towards the rivers where maybe the salinity is a little bit lower. Some sites, like the farms especially, are actually near the mouth of the estuary where the salinity might be a little bit higher, maybe just better environmental parameters for these green crabs as well. So it wasn't uniform, but I didn't find a major difference between these wild versus farm sites.
Okay, no, that's kind of understandable as well. And I like also the idea of what did you find in the gut? What is there? Did you figure out a percentage of whether it was oyster and mussel or other shellfish as well?
Yeah, so we're actually still running a lot of those gut samples from just like preliminary stuff. We did find some oyster DNA, but not enough where it's like a huge concern thus far. We still have a lot of guts to go through, but definitely a very mixed like scavenger diet. It's
Okay.
one of those things where I think if they're physically able to eat it, I think they will eat it. So as we go through more guts, we will get a better understanding of what percentage of oysters are they actually eating. And through kind of that last part, mimicking of the oyster farms, we didn't find a ton of damage from green crabs, but when we did, it was from a large green crab and a
Hmm.
smaller oyster, like inch and a half size is what we found so far.
Okay, so bigger crab, smaller oyster would be affected more so than
Yeah.
same size or anything like that. Okay.
Yeah, so if it was about 2 inches or more, really did not find any damage from green crabs on those oysters. It was really 2 inches or less that we found any sort of damage.
Is there a plausibility that the crabs may also help out in the biofouling off of farmed, let's say a Vexar bag or something like that,
Mhm.
and they would clean off some stuff. And if there's larger oysters there, they can't actually get into the large oysters if it's a smaller crab.
Right. So in some of the videos, there were a couple clips actually where green crabs were like on the bags, like kind of clawing at the
Hmm.
bag. So I do think actually they could be a potential biofouling cleaner in some
Hmm.
sense. And if it's in a bag with larger oysters, you have a good shot of them not eating the oysters and maybe even potentially cleaning the bag a little bit.
Okay. I have a grower in Ireland that puts their shells back out in the bay, the empty shells from the restaurant, and the crabs clean them up, and then he
Yeah.
takes those shells and sells them to pharmaceuticals. So it's a beneficial crab in that sense.
Mhm.
Maybe we can train them into doing something good before we eat them. That's great. That's very interesting stuff for me to be able to talk to customers about as well, which I think is fun. Very good. Alicia, I've got a question as well. You said that there's a lot of specific impact of the crab specifically in spring. So seasonality in this situation.
Yeah, so our oyster farm has two different sites, and we work between primarily suspended cultures. So we use oyster grow cages and then floating bags, but we overwinter our floating bags in bottom cages. So as we're raising our equipment, particularly at the more shallow site, uh, this year we saw the most green crabs we've ever seen. It felt like we were farming green crabs. It was eerie as we pulled up our equipment, where we actually had bushel after bushel of green crabs. It felt kind of like a horror movie. And we had no idea what to do with them because right now it's like kind of depressing and goes against everything you kind of believe in, but we like kill them. But when you have maybe 6 bushels after raising 3 cages, you don't know what to do. And so we found ourselves having a new experience this year, but we see them far less frequently in the suspended equipment. Not to say we don't find them, because we definitely do, but they were much larger in size, and just significantly more of them. And we even just saw variations in the equipment that we use between like a bottom tray, which is a little more enclosed, versus a condo, which is more open. But as we pulled out bags, our entire bags were covered in oysters. And so we see them more in the spring, but I think that is more related to like where they are. So they're on the bottom, they're easily climbed into. It's more like a trap than a floating piece of equipment.
Interesting, that for sure. Do you think there's a, what you're saying the table or the tray type would not have as many crab to it? Sort of suspended not the oyster bags not on the bottom, but just off them. You think there's a plausible way you could do that to overwinter them?
I'm sorry, that cut out a little bit, but I think what I took away was like, is there a difference between the equipment and maybe a way to prevent oysters? Or with the
yeah,
crab?
I was suggesting that you could not put the bags on the bottom, but just raise it a little bit, suspend it somehow, just to save from the winter, but not on the bottom.
So at this particular site, we're actually in 2 feet of water at our mean low tide. So our equipment is raised about 6 inches off of the bottom before the first bag. But we risk exposure at big low tides. We just had a negative 1.97 foot tide. So basically it's like one of the times of the year where we actually fully exposed, which is a risk that we run. So at that particular site, I think that maybe the best course of action, which unfortunately for us is like the one we wouldn't want to take. We actually prefer these, what we call oyster condos to the trays. They're just like easier to work with, they're lighter, there's like less surface area for fouling to grow and things, but that's why they're more accessible. So, but at our other site, we actually decided last year not to sink our equipment, and we saw almost no green crabs. Now we ran the risk of ice running out of the river and a cove area that could be much more problematic to the equipment maybe than the green crabs. But in our case, I think that's kind of a battle that we're struggling with, and we don't know, kind of as Kelsey noted, like what is the actual impact resulting in like mortality related to green crabs. Most of our seed is kept in really small mesh, so larger crabs aren't able to enter. We kind of have 2 lines of defense in like the oyster trays, for example. We put bags inside of it instead of having them open like other people would farm without bags.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's kind of one of the things that we're investigating. And then I think our bigger problem is, what do we do when we have all the crabs? Initially, you know,
right, that's the question.
Like, you know, I thought I was really woke to it, and my younger sister probably is more qualified to speak on this panel than I am. She did a science fair project focusing using green crabs for lobster bait. But suddenly we have we almost stop what we're doing, because we're like, we have 6 bushels of crabs, there's nowhere else for them to go. Like, this is back in May, and we can't put them back in the water, it feels unethical. And then I'm like, oh, people like compost them. But like, I think the discovery that we kind of made is, she's like, you can't just like put these live crabs in compost, and you can't do it in the backyard. And like, our discovery was that you know, crabs can live like 2 to 3 weeks out of the water, and they can live in almost any salinity. And like, the best thing we could do is like steam all of them and then maybe compost them. Or people are like, make a stock. I'm like, I don't need 6 bushels of crab to make a stock. You know, I need like 6 crabs.
But this is where I think possibly you could get a relationship with a local restaurant or something that would take it off your hands. And it's, do you think it would be a value add for some of your better clients?
So this year, day one, we were kind of like thrown off because we'd never seen so many crabs on our equipment or in the farm. So like, we hadn't even investigated that avenue. And then we had some videos on our social media kind of go baby viral and get like 400,000 views and a lot of interactions. And through that, we did acquire some level of interest from seafood distributors. But after our equipment was raised, we were seeing significantly fewer crabs. And we didn't dedicate time to going and like setting traps and like diversifying our business in that regard. Not to say it's not something we would do, but we did generate some interest. And I think that is like a place that we're interested in, but I found that the interest was particularly in like larger crabs. So when we have all these like pea-sized crabs and we've got like 1 million of them, basically we ended up stomping on all of them, which is maybe one of the most depressing and weird, uncomfortable things I've ever done in my life. And I swore, I was like, someday we're gonna think back and think we just crushed $10,000.
That'll be the thing in the future, hopefully,
Yeah.
that you will see. But it's the learning curve as well, and it's also getting restaurants to introduce them to the restaurants and stuff as well. And then there's the consistency. So restaurateurs, chefs want to have the consistency. I want to make sure I can get it every single time. But you can't. That's where I think you can go and say, well, it's rare and wonderful. And when they're available, boom, they're here. And nothing crazy and kill them all. Thanks very much. They'll head to the flavor of your stuff. But interesting concept and the seasonality thing as well. Jason, we've got a question here for you. Someone who's harvested green crabs and oysters in southern New England, can you talk a little bit about the respective interactions between the crabs and the oysters? What have you seen in that region?
So it's been interesting that the juvenile green crabs tend to be pretty much food for the small punters or brigals and the juvenile blackfish that love a lot of the oyster farms in these salt ponds, because some of the salt ponds where these guys are, cultivating the oysters or growing the oysters are fairly shallow. I did work on one oyster farm, Quani Siren oysters, where a few of the cages were fairly deep, 6 feet, compared to most of the salt ponds here. And we were seeing larger blackfish, pound and a half blackfish in the cages. So they were keeping some of the green crabs at bay. But I think with regard to the juvenile oysters, and I mean, we don't have a wild oyster population in Rhode Island. I mean, we have a very small one. There's zero harvest of them. But I think with the soft shell clams, they've done a lot of damage. And I think just with their population has changed. And I'm hearing about how many you're seeing in Maine and how many I'm seeing down here now. They're disappearing, and not they're going to go away forever. But I think there's been some temperature changes or environmental changes where certain times a year, like literally now, when the water temp cools, I'm seeing a lot of green crabs. And I'll catch more green crabs from now through December than I used to catch from, say, May through September. So it's been interesting. It's funny. As a good friend of mine who fishes and fish traps, fish pots, lobster pots, he says setting traps is about the most amazing thing if you want to check out an ecosystem, and especially a crab trap. So we're also seeing, like, I had 15 juvenile sea bass in my crab trap 2 days ago in 2 feet of water. So 15 3-inch sea bass. So I think they're probably feasting on these green crabs as well.
So the fish are feeding on the crabs.
Yes.
And so with the influx of them, then you're going to get more fish in the pot. Can you sell the fish?
Too small. I mean, these are literally 3-inch fish.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, these, it's amazing.
And so when you harvest, you sell the crab as bait for lobster and other things?
I sell the crabs mostly now for food or for hook baits for blackfish.
Okay, so how do you produce for hook bait? Like, because some of them are pretty small. So the
If
hook is
it,
usually big.
yeah, if it can fit on a hook, it's big enough.
Okay.
You know, we always laugh about that. Blackfish don't
Right,
care.
it's always big enough. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And
If
yeah,
they're
of
hungry,
course, you
they're
want
hungry.
to selling for food, you'll get more money.
Yes. So what
Yeah.
I've done though, I've changed the market here for some folks, and it's some folks aren't too happy about it, but I could care less. You know, it's one of those things. Let's create a value for these things and a market for these things. So I used to get $25 a bushel for green crabs going back 10, 12 years ago. I'm now getting $60 a bushel. And the first time someone complained, I said, well, go to the bait shop. The bait shop's getting, you know, $4 a dozen, you know, $5 a dozen for, and I mean, it doesn't matter what size they are.
So the bait shop buys the bait crab off of you for a bag, and then they'll split it, take the big ones out and do $4 a dozen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Probably what I would do
fun.
at the oyster bar too, if I could get it for the, if I, you'd always go back, right? But I would also like to, I'd speak with the fisherman first and say, what do you need for this? And you tell me
Sure.
the price, and then I'm good with that. And then I would sort of split it up. And if you can do it that way, that's great. And so you would get like various different sizes. How big do these things get?
I've had a few monsters this year. I mean, in the realm of big green crabs, I had a couple. I think I'm saving to cook them up and actually eat them just for the meat. I mean, I was like,
Huh.
it was the size
Like
of a
size
small
of a
blue
traditional
crab.
blue crab, or
Yeah, a
like
little smaller, but the
okay.
size of a juvenile, you know, a blue crab that's just undersized. I should measure a few just for fun, but
It's always good because then it's easier for the restaurateur to understand exactly what they're going to get,
sure,
even if it is a mixed bag of stuff. And if I got a mixed bag, I think it would be interesting for me. I would totally get a mixed bag because I want you to do less work. And me, I would do the work. Take out the big ones, use those as singles, and you eat them or whatnot. And then smallers, and then tiny ones, maybe into the chowder, like sprinkle them on top or something. And the middle ones
sure.
will go into the oyster bar. So I figure out different ways of using the various different sizes. I do that with oysters when they come in as well. Mike, I got to ask you this question about sizes and then molting and then soft shell. This is like ridiculous for me because we all know how fantastic the soft shell crab season. It hits early spring and it goes bonkers. I was one of the first in Toronto that would always get it. And people would be yelling at me, when's the crab coming? When's the crab coming? So if you can molt a green crab, that's exciting for me.
Yeah, certainly. We are very much piggybacking on the success of other soft shell crab species, namely blue crab. And there are some differences, of course, between blue crab and green crab, notably the size. I don't see that as a big problem. You know, you take a burger bun and you throw on one blue crab, well, then you just throw on two green crabs and
Slider.
it works just fine. And the sliders in particular at Row 34, which is a chain of restaurants, you know, Portsmouth, Burlington, Boston, Cambridge, their green crab slider is extremely popular and it's delicious. And so, yeah, it's the, you know, soft shell crab sells. And that's one thing about trying to find these markets for green crab. This is one that is not a challenge in any way, shape, or form as far as selling them. The challenge is to determine the methods and the efficiencies to make it a viable economic venture.
And how, you know, not to tell us your secret or anything, how do you molt these things?
There's not too many secrets. So I was a high school science teacher. I taught marine science at York High. And through some school projects, I got to meet Gabby Brott and Marissa McMahon. And so I got to give them a lot of the credit. They did a lot of the science surrounding the molting season and took all the morphological cues from the Venetian fishery. They have a slightly different Mediterranean subspecies in the Mediterranean there, obviously, that presents in the same way before it molts. So we look at the underside for this specific morphological cue of a crab that is likely to molt in the next few weeks, maybe even to a month, and you set those crabs aside. So in particular, we're looking for male crabs in May and June that show that morphological cue. You keep them, and then, you know, we've adapted the methods. We don't have generations of knowledge that the Venetians have, so our eye was not, at least to start, quite as sharp. So we were a bit innovative on the gear and trying to find ways that that you can store massive amounts of crabs safely from each other, because when they are very close to molting, what we call busters, we place them in solitary confinement because if it molts in the presence of other green crabs, it will be cannibalized. So we modified what Marissa and Gabby were using for what they call crab condos, and made them into a much more efficient device that we could check our gear quickly. They were using cut up oyster bags into all these little compartments. The crabs can crawl up them, they can crawl out of them. Had bungees, all this kind of stuff that was just far too inefficient. I mean, it worked on a small scientific scale, but having some background in fisheries, working as a lobsterman, and my business partner is a lobsterman, we had an understanding about the commercial efficiency that you need to reach in order to have a method that's going to be able to produce significant quantities of green crabs. So that's what we're working on. We've been at it for 3 seasons now, modifying gear, modifying methods, and trying to molt out green crabs in different locations. So
is there plausibility that you could molt them consistently over time if you had the greatest volume of them? Through a year type of thing.
Expanding the season is one aspect of that. And you can determine where you have your green crab farm. If you put it up the estuary a ways where the water's warmer, we have found that process is extremely temperature dependent. We've had, small scale molting facilities in different locations over the past few years and compared them, side by side or year to year. I should mention right now that green crab are an unregulated species in Maine. So we did not technically need to have an aquaculture lease when we're doing this at small scales. You've just got a few lobster crates in this location, a few over here and stuff like that. So everyone that we talked to just said, yeah, just go for it. Keep it small. Don't bring too much attention to it, I guess. But you could extend the season by being in warm water early and then cooler water closer to the mouth of an estuary to extend it a little bit further. Because the molting season is essentially, gets going at the end of May here in Maine and it wraps up in early July. So it's not a long season. So that's one thing we're interested in is how to prolong the season, but also just looking more so at kind of the animal husbandry. How densely can you keep your pre-molt crabs in a crate? What type of sorting methods do you use to kind of take it easy on them? Because there's a lot of handling of the crabs. And then obviously how you store them right before they molt as busters. So a lot of science has been going on. There's been some successes, there's been many failures, but we're getting a little better at it each year.
I think that's the main concept, is to practice that thing. And how long has the Venetians been doing this, do you think?
That's a great question. I really don't know. I'm guessing, generations is what I've heard, that they have generational fishermen and they do it a little bit different. We're gonna explore their methods. They are known as Mocante. We call them that, the Mocante method. And they've sharpened their eyes so much to the point where they can just look into a crate. They call them Vieries. They're a bit bigger than our lobster crates, maybe 3 to 4 times the size, but they can just look at the green crabs in the water and be able to pick out those ones that are busters by how they take on a slightly different aquamarine color on their carapace. And they're really, really quick and efficient with that. Whereas as we were learning, we were handling each and every crab, probably weekly, if not twice a week, just to check for those signs that it's a buster. So I think we've gotten sharp enough that we can try to implement that method and compare it to the methods that we've pioneered ourselves.
Amazing. That's great stuff. And you found the restaurants who take these softies on, how do they find the texture, flavor, whatever, comparatively to blue crab?
Very similar. I personally think it's a bit more palatable. I remember I've only had blue crab once as soft shell, and I remember looking at it, I was like, that's a sizable organism, and I'm going to consume this whole thing, So there was a little bit of a shock value there. I think that is decreased with green crabs. But yeah, the chefs love them, and they do them in different ways. They serve them up as appetizers. I mean, most of the time it is deep fried or tempura fried or sauteed.
Mm.
So there is variability in how chefs are preparing them, but Black Trumpet is a very nice restaurant in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they have not changed their recipe. They're always reinventing their menu, but what they have going with green crab and their tempura fried green crab, they haven't touched it in 3 years. And so I think that's a testament to the quality of what they've got going when green crab season rolls around. Yeah, they sell. They're always, every restaurant's asking us for more and more and more. And we provide to 7 restaurants, but we have never, I mean, I think we had like 1 or 2 weeks where we actually met their demand, and that was in the peak of our molt. And so that is the
So
challenge.
it'd still be a seasonal thing then.
Oh yeah, I think it always will be, you know, unless through science and experimentation, you could find ways to trigger the molt. And they do that with some different crab species. So that might be down the line a little bit, but you know, for now, on a smaller budget, doing that kind of within the environment in situ molting is kind of where I see this going before it goes into, you know, molting and shedding facilities that,
Right.
I mean, I still think even with blue crab, that's still very much a seasonal molt.
Oh,
And
totally. It's totally a seasonal thing, and
Yeah.
that's why it becomes that celebration. But you always see you can get soft shell crab at sushi joints like all year long because they've
Yep.
taken the IQF, freeze them, etc.
Yeah,
So they have that.
and
consistency.
we haven't yet experimented with that. When we've had product, we sell it. And so
Yeah.
I would like to in this next season to just see how well they vacuum seal and freeze, and what the duration of the product is.
Do you pull the gills on the soft shells?
Before they are
Right.
cleaned before, but we give
Yeah.
them to the restaurants live.
Right.
So we put them in seafood trays with a little bit of seaweed, and off they go. And then they're not sitting in refrigerators for very long. We do know through some experimentation that they can last for about a week. So you do have some capacity to ship over distances, but usually they're sold in no time.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's great. Mary, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of pivot to asking you some questions, Patrick. So as someone who, and if you guys all look at the top of the chat, you'll see a lovely oyster platter with some green crabs next to it. As a restaurateur and somebody who works in the oyster industry, what are the potential intersections that you see between green crabs and oysters, whether coming from the supply side or even like envisioning green crabs on the raw bar?
The way that I've always envisioned working with fishermen first and see how they work in their seasons and timings. And if they have something that pops up that's special, that's great, or they have a wild oyster available, that's super. And then we go into the farmed oyster and we flip it through the season. I'm never one who needs to have something super consistent, but I'm sort of a rare bird when it comes down to chefs and restaurateurs. Sometimes they want to have that consistency. Like, I got to put this on the menu for the next 3 months. I want to change the menu daily. That's what I did. As I changed the menu daily, which accommodates for those things. And if the shipment doesn't through, the shipment doesn't through. There's sometimes that happens as well. But if there's a situation where, like my fisherman friend said, I got to get rid of these crab, what do I do with them? Absolutely, I would totally look at that and see how we can play into it. And I changed the kitchen as well. So I'm going to put them on a cold bar. So we had figured out there's different ways to do. You can't just like crab, you would just plunk it in the. Well, these little crabs, little legs go plink, they pop right off, and you've got this carapace and little things. I found out over time that you had to actually start in sort of a cool water and slowly raise the temperature up if you're going to do it on mass, so that actually legs stay on it for those who are going to do this type of thing. And then you season the water, all that type of stuff. So as far as interaction goes, whatever we can do on the restaurant side to help the farming system create and use what's in the environment. Bycatch. I would always like this when I was asking some other person, the captain, about bycatching the fish. If it's too small, we're not going to use it. But if it's there, can you sell it? And can you sell it to your client? Right size. Because I know there's licenses, and if you don't have a license to actually harvest the fish out and you move it along, but that's what to do. Looks like I'm freezing.
I think we got the gist of what you were saying, and I also think it's really cool to see also like raw bars who are working with green crabs, their different approaches to them. One thing that I'm also really excited about, and that we're going to be focusing on more with greencrab.org is drinking green crabs. Whether that's in a michelada or a dirty crab martini, we're going to have some more recipes coming out. A green crab Caesar that you'll find on our website for those Canadians out there. There's a lot of different ways that we could see green crabs in a raw bar environment. Keeping an eye out though at the time, I'm going to pivot to some audience questions. Starting off, we have a question from Willow. Thanks to all for these insights. How do you navigate or balance the concept goal of eradicating or minimizing the population of green crabs due to their invasiveness or a nuisance to oysters, other valuable species, and the desire to keep them around due to the emerging market? I'm going to answer like half of this question, which I think is a really important point and question that we get a lot at greencrab.org, which is, why are you trying to build a fishery that you're trying to destroy? And I think looking at the reality of the fact that a green crab can produce up to 185,000 eggs per year, they spread so easily. And they're not just an issue here in New England. You'll also find invasive green crabs on the West Coast, in Argentina, in Australia. They have invaded every single continent outside of their native range except for Antarctica. And so what most science is saying is that no matter how much fishing pressure we put on green crabs, we'll never be able to completely get rid of them. But I think that from the perspective of a harvester, investing in a fishery that is going to be here in the future is something that's important. And so Jason, I know you've talked a little bit about kind of how the fishery has been changing in Rhode Island. Like, what are your thoughts on this? And as somebody who has been in the fishery for a couple of years, do you see the green crab fishery going anywhere in Rhode Island? And how do you navigate this balance?
Well, I think I'm going to continue harvesting. As I said, certain times a year, they're really abundant. But what I'm hearing, and it's interesting hearing from folks from Maine, we're building a food co-op, processing, seafood processing facility, and we have someone that's going to be selling us lobsters from Maine. And those lobsters are going to get shipped 8 hours from, I mean, he is down east, or we're going to drive to get them. But the words that came out of his mouth last year, he said, we started trapping green crabs just to see how many we could get. And I noticed that Mike uses the same traps that I use. They're like a hexagon. I love those things. You get so many and they fall out. These guys are filling those traps in 3 hours. 3 hours. He said if they actually put an effort in on catching them, they could fill an 18-wheeler in a week and drive it to Rhode Island to be processed. So our goal is at some point to be able to process these things en masse with a jumbo baiter machine and start feeding people. Because from what he was saying, he has never seen them. He's a native Mainer. His dad, who is, I think, in his 80s now, said he has never seen anything like this in his life. He said they have taken over, and it's frightening. I mean, I start hearing about the oyster farm. What Alicia was saying, it's like people can't fathom it until they see it. So I don't think we have to worry about these going away. My friends in British Columbia, some of the indigenous folks up there are absolutely frightened that these things are going to impact the gooey duck. And if that happens, they're going to lose an entire way of living. So yeah, I think we need to try to eradicate them, even though we are not going to. I wouldn't be going in the direction I'm going if I thought these things were going to disappear. I will do my part, though.
If I can just make one comment too, like, I think there's an important piece of like creating a market for green crabs beyond wanting to destroy it, but because they're destroying other wild species populations. So in Maine, one of the biggest things is there's in areas like Brunswick, for example, I believe the town of Brunswick alone has 60 miles of coastline and a massive area for wild clam harvesting. And really intensely focusing on like the viability of wild clams and seeing a pretty significant decline in clam populations. And so we have a wild fishery that is not necessarily being considered overfished, or overharvested. It's being decimated by green crab populations. And there's evidence up and down the coast of Maine. But I know like in that community, they're just very good about sharing all the efforts they're making to evaluate that. And so, yeah, and a farmed product, alternatively, it's finite. So we get out what we put in and nothing more, and very likely significantly less. And so to create a byproduct from something that's like reducing our output is important. But I think, like Jason said, they're not really going anywhere. That I think we all kind of can agree that they don't die, they multiply.
And if I could jump in just for a sec, there is, yes, we are creating a fishery and we're trying to significantly decrease the population such that all the ecological benefits that come with eradicating the species, or not eradicating, but decreasing the population significantly can be seen. Clams coming back, stable marsh banks that store all the carbon, protect the uplands, all those kinds of things, that they're all great. So if I'm fishing an estuary and I'm just looking to make money off this species, I'll fish that estuary. Then when catch rates go down, I could go and jump to another estuary and I could cycle through. Okay, that's not going to do the ecological benefits that you want. I think there is additional revenue sources from bounty programs. Take a town like Brunswick. They've got a shellfish commission with a little bit of money. I bet they would pay money. They already do things like seeding and netting. And from what I've learned, there's only one place in New England that has had a significant bounty program, and that is Essex and Ipswich, as the Great Marsh in general. And if you get clams, if you get steamer clams, soft shell clams, odds are they're coming from Essex and Ipswich. The shellfish constable down there recently retired, but I spoke to him a number of years ago. He said he believes you get 4 times the bang for your buck out of trapping green crabs as opposed to seeding and netting, which is also labor intensive. So I think that's really the only model that's been tested. You know, we're fishing in Brave Boat Harbor, this tiny estuary on the York-Kittery border. And we got lucky. We had a natural set of clams that set up before I started the operation. But now I was talking to a clammer just yesterday, and he went out, our recreational season just started. I said, are you seeing any smaller clams? You know, that would be evidence of clams that have settled since our operation got going. He's like, yeah, there's a whole bunch of like 1/2 inch, 1 inch clams. I'm like, okay, that's great. Because for almost a generation, there hasn't been clams in Brave Boat Harbor. And so I'm very interested to see in the next 5, 10, 15 years, if with continued fishing pressure in Brave Boat Harbor, the York River, or the other estuaries that we fish, are we going to see, you know, viable and robust clam stocks and in the clam resource? And I think we might. So that'll be an indicator that we're doing a great job. And if we are doing that, then a bounty program, I think, is very much warranted and would be appreciated by the shellfish commissions or state.
And I just added to the group chat too a blog post that we did in an interview with retired Constable Scott LaPrest a few years ago, as well as there's also a link to Nubar Alexanian's film, Recipe for Disaster, that really highlights green crabs on the Great Marsh and their specific approach to this. I'll also just like giving a little feedback. I'll definitely say that like we see a lot of green crabs come out of Ipswich and Essex. And I think a huge part of that is because of this bounty program. In fact, for anybody who wants to order green crabs directly to their house, if you are in the continental US, you can head over to Wolf's Fish website and you can order 2-pound packs of frozen green crabs that are harvested by Zach Appletoft, who is coming from Rowley, Ipswich, and Essex. So moving on, we have a question from Avery Little for Kelsey. Do eelgrass habitats provide any safety for baby oysters / oyster spat against green crabs? Have you found that green crabs congregate in eelgrass beds at all?
Yeah, so eelgrass is definitely super important. And eelgrass can provide, protection for certain species. I know like juvenile fish, will go in eelgrass and things like that. Eelgrass is also super important, for shoreline protection to help prevent, erosion, and things like that. I personally don't know how many green crabs are in eelgrass beds in New Hampshire. I know through like videos and things like that, they have seen, green crabs in eelgrass beds. I do know that green crabs can actually pull up the eelgrass shoots. So green crabs can, cut down eelgrass, clip them, pull up the shoots. So yeah, green crabs can destroy eelgrass beds, which would then, consequently affect, other species like juvenile fish, oysters that might be in there. If they destroy enough eelgrass habitats, that then can create erosion issues and then affect shoreline protection. So that's like a whole chain of effects that can happen if enough green crabs decide to like destroy these eelgrass beds.
Cool, thank you so much. And then we have one additional question that is coming in from an event that we participated in with Shipwright's Daughter and the James Beard Platform Foundation the other night. This was a question that came up several times, and this was an event where Jason's green crabs were featured on the menu, including in a cocktail by Shipwrights that included an oyster vermouth and a green crab bourbon, which I thought was just such a cool way to marry those two species. But Jason, you've started supplying directly to a lot of restaurants, including Shipwright's Daughter. How does this fit in with harvesting and supplying other species? And also like looking at the intersections of like an oyster harvester, there could also be a green crab harvester. Could you talk a little bit more about the balance between being a green crab harvester, harvesting multiple species, and also have you seen that there is like an uptick in demand for green crabs on the culinary side in the past few years?
Yeah, I say on the last question, there's definitely more interest, and actually more interest with just personal home chefs. So I've been selling some of my green crabs, dockside sales, to people that just want to cook them and try them and eat them, which I found pretty interesting. And it's mostly thanks to you and David at Shipwrights for really, in this area, making it a popular species to eat. But I think with the way the fisheries are going, and it's funny that Mike had mentioned, conch, and I was talking about fish prices in general. I am a multi-species fisherman. I mean, we're working on slipper snails right now, and it's again changing a market, and people are like, you can't eat those, and you can't eat this. It's like we've been pigeonholed into, okay, you can only eat flounder, cod, halibut, haddock, and that's it, and flounder. And it's like, no, you can eat just about everything that comes out of the ocean. I think for oyster farmers, for anybody that's in aquaculture and shellfish aquaculture, just look at the permitting, and there might not be any because I think green crabs are still unregulated, just like slipper snails. We have a dockside dealer's license, so I can sell slipper snails and green crabs with no issue. And I'll tell you right now, I have some of my friends that are just looking at me like I'm crazy until I literally show them my landings for the month. And I said, I get $2 a pound for slipper snails that are more abundant than green crabs. So I'm selling between 100 and 300 pounds of those a week. So I've shifted this time of year from finfish to crabs and slipper snails. I make more money. And it's easier to harvest. I don't have to always use my boat. But I think anyone in the fishing business just needs to look into the permitting behind whether or not they can harvest and sell them. I think you have to get a commercial license. I know you have to have a commercial license in Rhode Island to do it. So you would have to look into getting a commercial license. However, you could in Rhode Island purchase from a licensed commercial harvester. And with a peddler's permit and the right licensing, you could be able a fishmonger and sell them. But again, you have to look at each state as having, you know, everybody has different regs. Rhode Island is probably one of the strictest. But I suggest we really all need to start looking at alternatives, alternative sources of protein that everybody can afford, number one. But number two is that these things are really abundant. They're fairly easy to catch. And it's been nothing but good for me. I mean, it is, and I shared that story with Mary that during COVID, these things saved my life. So it's like people find that funny. I don't. It was the fishery closed and people wanted green crabs. So I paid my mortgage with green crabs at those years.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up the conversation and talking about our need for diversified fisheries, but also how green crabs could fit into the landscape for oyster farmers. I am going to wrap up this conversation since we planned on ending at noon, but I just wanted to thank everybody who participated in this call, and also encourage anyone who has questions or thoughts that pop up in the future. Please feel free to reach out to me via email. We're also about to kick off the second weekend of Green Crab Week. And there are quite a few participating restaurants where you can enjoy green crabs and oysters simultaneously. I mentioned the Shipwright's Daughter earlier. That's where you can taste Jason's green crabs. And they also have some oyster dishes on the menu, as well as their oyster and green crab cocktail, the Davy Jones Manhattan. If you are in Boston, you can swing by the Boston Public Market. You can pick up some green crabs at Red's Best. These are coming from Pete Mason of FB Kestrel. And also try a green crab dish at Seven Hills Pasta. And then in New York City, if you're in New York, there are two places that are serving up green crabs and oysters right now. Greenpoint Fish and Lobster, where you can also purchase green crabs, enjoy some oysters, and then Jeffrey's Grocery in Greenwich Village. That is where I chowed down on a green crab bisque atop a swordfish yesterday and had some lovely pico oysters. So yeah, hope you all have a chance to go out and celebrate Green Crab Week this week. Feel free to reach out with any questions. And we are going to be putting together again a blog post with this recording, as well as some highlights and some links to each participating panelist information. Awesome. Thank you all again. I am going to close up the call, and happy Green Crab Week.